This morning we're going to have we're going to open with a little panel with Hank, Niels, and Greg Brechin, just like at a big university or something.
Oh, I know where to get away from.
Please have seats. As our resident regional historian, Hank recognizes a lot of this, of course, and so he's going to give a few minutes of some local perspective on it. You all know Hank Niels, I'm sure, but if you're not aware of this book, On the Hill, An Interpretive History, it's a marvelous history of this spot, and I sure learned a lot from it. Hank has a number of other publications out, including his great trail book, and I understand the new edition of the trail book is in the works. Most of you, all of you were here last night, so I don't have to say any more.
Well,
and after they're done, we're going to have questions with them. They're going to talk to each other a little bit, and then we're going to all open it up.
first of all, I want to thank Ray for a mighty informative presentation last night. And I think we ought to, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
If you can't, too bad. Huh? Let's start at the beginning. In 1848, there were people here. As a matter of fact, if you look at the figures statewide, 1770, there were an estimated 310,000 indigenous people in California. By 1845, it's down to 150,000. In the decade between 1845 and 55, we're down to 50,000. So that'll tell you a little something about the gold rush. True, there is racism and violence, but primarily it was the introduction of diseases that wiped them out and the disruption of a lifestyle that involved moving around and exploiting or using resources at different elevations. The Indians found themselves oddly in competition with the livestock that the Europeans brought because they ate pretty much the same food. And the livestock had to be fenced in and the livestock had to be near the springs. So they found themselves fenced out of areas that they traditionally used for thousands of years. When Jonas Specht was the first white guy to find gold on the Yuba River, and that was in June of 1848, down around Parks Bar, in that general area where Highway 20 crosses the Yuba River. And what he found when he found the Indians, it was in June, like I said, they found several hundred Indians eating clover nude. Now, most of the accounts I read about, clover was a big deal after the winter. You have all this chlorophyll suddenly. And people were so happy with it, they would get down on their hands and knees and graze it. Now this is a pretty picture to us because we're weird. But to the white guys who were coming here, this further substantiated their notion that they were animals. You know, I mean, even though it is really a beautiful picture, let's have. What can you do, Dan, about bringing that back to you? They got a festival on an annual basis.
Only the solstice.
I'm sure the Yuba County Water Agency will be extremely interested.
I have to bring this up since you brought it up. Michael and Serge and I last June, I think late in June, were at Cut-Eye Foster's Bar on North Yuba, wallowing in the beauty of it all, when he mentions that he had just come from a meeting where the Yuba County Water Agencies referred to the Yuba Canyon as a resource conveyance.
A resource conveyance.
That's a footnote. Now, the very earliest mining is the mining of the river bars, and these are usually convex areas that are grown over and probably more likely than not had Native American camps on them. The first thing the miners do is discover that due to the action of eddies throwing back gravel, there's lots of gold in these old gravel bars. As the river cuts down and changes course, so the former river may be on this gravel bar. The river's carrying gold, so what they do is tear up the gravel bar much to the amazement of the local people, muddy the streams, and generally degrade the whole shape of the river canyon. This is no small thing when you think I think there are 31 bars on the North Yuba between Marysville and Downeyville. And each one of those bars, if they're called a bar or a campsite, that means there's a concentration of the people and a relatively great amount of damage going on. Then there are lots of smaller operations as well. At any rate, I'm just trying to make the point that they really compromise the quality of the river itself, from which I don't think it's ever really recovered. The very structure of the river, the shape of the river, etc. River mining, which Greg referred to, was very popular around here in the mid-50s, even though it involved a huge amount of gambling because you did it late in the season while the river was low and you just prayed that you wouldn't get an early storm and all your improvements would be washed downstream. But by 1857, 58, hydraulic mining has gone on to such a degree upslope that there are enough tailings coming down to have covered the river mining claims. So there's a bleak period. We were just talking about it, late 50s, where it was no longer a lark to mine, but people were realizing it. You had to be informed, and it was more of a business than an adventure. The very early years of the gold rush, there was a lot of adventurers as well. Okay, so about 1870, a major change takes place, and of course, 1869 we have the railroad, and that is really the creation of some real estate, and that's the patent process. Congress makes provisions for you to patent your land, which is creating private property, and that's still the case. When you see these, when you look at a topo map now and you see almost everything's in a rectangular layout, but you'll see these odd-shaped segments that are private property. Those are usually lode mines, patented mines. One of the issues, well, what that did, now that you could patent now that you had your claim patented, you could, and part of that was establishing right-of-way for ditches. That attracted investors because at about the same time, in the early 70s, I have some GLO maps over here, which are the first surveys done in this area. In the 1870s, GLO is a government land office, and it's a predecessor to Bureau of Land Management. Now that the land lines are laid out, it's broken into township and range and section. You can start saying this is mine and this is not yours.
And is this, the law that allowed you to patent the land, is that the 1872 money?
No, that's an 1870 patent.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and then there are homesteading laws before that, but this area was not so much a homesteaded area as it was a mining area. And then you, of course, have the 1872 mining law. The flood of all the other kinds of mining, so from an archaeological perspective, it's really interesting because you go out and you look at the features and you try to find things and you try to identify certain styles of mining. You're not going to find any indication of river mining because of hydraulic mining, which came after, because hydraulic mining just sort of wiped out everything that preceded it, including all the prehistoric archaeological sites along the riverbanks, unless they're well upslope. In 1861, 62 was probably the biggest storm we've ever had, biggest flood we've ever had in the valley. And that really emphasized, there are lots of comments about how much mud is in the river before that, but it flooded Marysville, of course, it flooded Sacramento, but it also, when it retreated, left behind lots of gravel on top of agricultural land. Now, this kind of slurry that comes out of the mines, out of the hydraulic mines, contains everything from gravel, cobbles, to really small siltation within it. It was called slickens, which I think is a great name. California mining terminology is based on English terms, Spanish terms, and some that were invented here in California. Now, slickens is one of those California words. And the best description I've ever heard of it is too thick to drink, too thin to plow. Well, anyway, this made enemies down below. And people up here were so immersed in the mythos of mining that when people objected in the valley, their attitude was, you should have known better than to plant in the floodplain. Because mining is what this state is all about. And it wasn't long after the railroad came in that agriculture was actually more important to the economy of the state than mining. But the people living up here, it just goes on and on. It's really interesting to read the newspapers in the late 1870s when the controversy was really heated up between the valley and the foothills about mining to see the attitudes that come from here. Now, there was we talked about the Sawyer decision, which put an end to hydraulic mining. Now, locally, that was only one of several injunctions. There was one in 1879. This was the first one by a Judge Kaiser in Marysville. In 1879, when he closed down the North Bloomfield Mining and Gravel Company, or put up an injunction against them. The response here, right here at Columbia Hill, was to, this is at a Hydraulic Miners Association meeting, was to hang an effigy of Judge Kaiser, shoot it with cannonballs, and then burn it. This is right here. They also ponied up $600 to go to the Hydraulic Miners Association. Now, Hydraulic Miners Association, by this time, there's already a lot of resentment. All the miners are employees. The Hydraulic Miners Association is made up of mine owners and mine managers. The people who are owning the mines around here are based in New York and San Francisco. There's a lot of resentment already. So the Hydraulic Miners Association is made up of, like I said, owners and managers. And yet they were collecting dues from working people. And they asked them, well, what do you do with this? How do you account for what you're collecting? And they said, well, we use it to bribe people. And obviously we can't give their names. And the other thing, one more comment about the slickings. People are, as you know, the South Yuba is our local version of the Ganges. I mean, people are absolutely out of their gourds about it, and it provides some spiritual benefit, right, Mark? To the locals. And one of the things that people love about going to the river is lying on the smooth rocks at the river. Now, these smooth rocks are created by, they've been tumbled, in essence, from the hydraulic mines. They're the direct legacy of the slickings polishing. So the next time you're out there, perceive the whole picture. Gray also alluded yesterday to the technology that was developed around here was then exported all over the world. Well, it's true that Hamilton Smith of North Bloomfield Mining and Gravel Company went to Venezuela, and he had quite a reputation as an expert on hydraulics. But on a more modest level, right here, the manager of the Eureka Lake Company, which mined right up here, was Ashley Bigelow. We still have, I don't know if Frank Bigelow is still alive in Birchville, but I interviewed him recently, 1997. But his, I guess it would be his great-grandfather, Ashley, he and 4 of his sons went, after the mines closed down here, after the Sawyer decision, in 1898, went to the Klondike. They were only there a little while, and where, according to Frank, a Russian prince suggested that they work for him. They were so impressed with their knowledge of hydraulic mining, which was considerable, that he took them to Siberia. And they worked in Siberia from 1898 to 1901. They came back, they established a quartz mine in Badger Hill called the Siberia Mine. So when you see that, now you know the rest of the
That's
story.
Frank's father. That's Frank's father.
Really?
Is that right?
Is he still alive?
Barely, I think he is, yeah.
I was saying barely in 97.
Yeah.
The amazing thing about Frank Bigelow, I loved interviewing him. He was wearing the open gown, he has a full-time attendant, and he could just barely move. You could just barely hear him speak, but he could laugh. Absolutely clearly. He's always telling jokes. So there's his life force. Which brings me to, a lot of people left at that point. Now, who stayed? We have families who stayed, like the Coughlins, the Bigelows, the Dudleys. There are quite a few around. And they kept it together by doing a combination of things, usually a little bit of ranching, a little bit of logging, a little bit of mining. And they had their hands on all of those things. But the population was way down at that point. And if we, there was another small boom around here post-World War II, where a lot of people like the Whittleseas and the Welkers and a lot of people came in here. There was a small-scale logging boom. Returning veterans, etc., kind of need these homes, so logging was seen in a patriotic context at the time, and some people still carry that, and you may have noticed. And then we came along, and I would say, and we've been here about 30 years. One of the things that I find fascinating, I mean, even though we've been ragging on miners, and rightly so, there are still, in doing research, and I know you've run across this, two things really stand out on the positive side, and one is their incredible creativity, and that's still true of miners, because I've met lots of miners in the time I worked for the Forest Service. Miners have to work with what's on hand, so this whole notion of ersatz invention, of making do with what you have. I've seen the most outrageous, not always environmentally friendly, but I've seen the most outrageous gewgaws duct taped and wired together to make things work. And I like to think that that's part of our legacy too, is that creativity. And the other one is humor. There is outrageous humor throughout. I was just reading this morning about a fly catching contest in Nevada City. And they actually counted all the flies. And I think the winner got over 400 and some thousand. And at the end they said, you'll probably not notice that. Anyway, I just think it's hilarious, and I think we have some of that. Which are good survival tools, creativity, humor. Another thing that we have as a result of that, which we're dealing with, is a kind of toxic legacy. Mining the huge amounts of mercury or quicksilver that were used in hydraulic mining. It's still around, both in an elemental form where you can actually see it, and in the form of methyl mercury, where the water slows down and gets a chance to heat up in the presence of carbon. Then it gets into the food chain. Places like Lake Wildwood, if you can call that a lake, it's actually a reservoir. Most lakes here are reservoirs. And Englebright, I'm sure, is another. The fish are, I believe USGS is going to come out with a warning this year that they're at a toxic level.
Yeah, they were working on it,
So we also have acid rock drainage, and we also have some arsenic, both legacy and mining. I did an abandoned mine survey for the Forest Service that lasted 4 years, and it's interesting. In looking at over 500 mines, the number one thing that came up were physical dangers of mines: open shafts, open adits, tunnels that present a lot of dangers. I remember walking just inside of an adit up on the side of Red Mountain, and it had a little plank across the puddle. I had a 10-foot tape measure, and it wasn't long enough. So the puddle was substantial. Not only that, but the puddle's pH was about 2, which is getting pretty close to battery acid. It beat my shoestrings for sure.
But when's it at, when we did the original site for the Grizzly Hill, site survey for the Grizzly Hill School, went down below the campus, and there was a 15-foot,
Yeah.
just below the school here, it's like 400 yards from that.
So that, and also another thing that we found that you can't downgrade is that almost all of them, mines of any size, have a shop of some sort with machinery, blacksmithing, etc. And there's a lot of petroleum contamination that goes with that too. And what we found about mercury is that the problem is systemic. EPA, of course, wants you to find point sources so they can address it and go deal with it. But the problem with mercury is everywhere. But they did find a bit of a point source, and that is the drain tunnels to the hydraulic mines. Think of a hydraulic mine, it's an old river. So, by the way, here's a map of the old tertiary systems over here. I want you to look at these maps. I'll talk about them in a minute. It would be in a river channel, so if you blast all the gravel out of it, it's a bit of a basin. Now, what do you do with the water and the material that you need to sluice and the tailings that are accumulating? Inside, you create a drain tunnel, which is a little bit lower and goes and empties into a convenient stream. The one at Malakoff is a huge one. It's almost 8,000 feet long. Now, this would also be the last sluice. And because it's continuing to drain, a lot of them have the sluice like out around the Polar Star, out around Dutch Flat right now. Because the wood in the sluice stays wet, it tends to stay there. It doesn't rot. And so you have an accumulation. It's still functioning as a sluice. It's collecting mercury, it's collecting amalgam, and it's collecting gold. So people are actually going there with that knowledge that this must be going on, and mining. But it's also pretty still, so you have methyl mercury going on in here too. And I was out with some USGS geologists, and they were really commenting on how much, when the ground heats up in these hydraulic pits and you have these mercury spills, how much vapor is actually coming off the ground. Not throughout, but just in hot spots. But you don't know where those hot spots are. So when you're standing, don't have lunch in a hydraulic pit. Let's just put it that way.
Who here has?
So that's just really a brief look at how it affects us locally here. I mean, hopefully your questions will draw me out a little bit more in grade 2, but it seems to me that our tribe, we've been here, say, 30 years or so, we've opted for being nice to the resources, living a little bit more simply, keeping the creativity and humor part. And, what are our chances of sustaining this? I see 2 generations worth right here.
Rising meeting?
Yeah.
Oh, boy. That's what I want to
Considering that
say.
you have cars.
Yes.
We do, yeah, we're not perfect,
How nice.
but we're working on it.
Well, that's the tough one, because I'm thinking I've got to bail out of the city. It's gotten to be too much for me. So I'm looking at Inverness over in West Marin, which of course is becoming even more expensive than this place is becoming, because people, it's so desirable. The problem is, and I want to basically live a lot simpler than I'm living in the city, but I have no choice but to drive. And so, I'm very aware of the immense amounts of energy it requires for me to live out there, and I can't get around without it. I like the bicycle, but then after my friend Bob had his bicycle accident, we were all sort of thinking about how safe is it to bicycle anymore. So I don't know. There are certain things we need to do, and when you begin thinking in terms of energy flows, and you begin to be aware of these responsibilities that most of us don't want to think about. That's what I was talking about. The larger the city becomes, of course, the less aware people become of their responsibilities, and so that's why an ecological education is so important. But I really admire people out here who have managed to get off the grid And, I mean, that's a big step, obviously. But we still need to try it. That's what I can't get around. But I'm definitely in favor of stepping down one standard of living.
Well, we're having a sort of another gold rush going on in this county right now. People moving in and building huge homes.
That's happening in Inverness too.
And you talk, I was at a meeting for appropriate affordable housing, and one guy stood up and said, "My understanding is of affordable housing is you can afford it, you can build it, right?" And so there's a lot of this sort of blatant attitude moving into our area. It hasn't reached here yet, but
Oh, it will.
It will,
Well,
yeah.
I don't know. Maybe with the stock market doing what it is, it won't. But that was one of the things I found most disturbing about the whole ethos of the 1990s, particularly towards the latter part of it, was this extraordinary sense of entitlement that people had. And I hope I'm going to see so much of that actually. But this absolutely squandering of stuff because they could afford to do it.
well, what we have up here, right with you, man. I think what we have here and what really fascinates people is a sense of community, and people tune into it right away as it being worth more than stuff, and that's what we want to really sustain.
And that's the same is true at Inverness too. There's very much of a sense of community. And as a matter of fact, when you look in the newspaper, everybody's looking for housing out there. And I've actually seen advertisements say, ".comers not welcome." Because the .comers are seen essentially as parasites who move in, build these monster houses, and don't want to have anything to do with the community. They basically just want to use their computers and everything. And the way that obviously, they're very, very concerned, as I'm sure you are, with people who move in have to be involved in the community there. So that's one of the things I like most about it.
So we're going to open this up to general questions, and Don is right there.
Well, we often think of a recycling of energy or some resources as being a very healthy sign. And perhaps now, all of this money coming in from urban areas is the first time that the money that went out during the gold rush and the timber exploitation is being recycled back.
That's interesting. Yeah, it could be.
And of course, you can tell that all the people living here are really quite flush from receiving that incoming wealth.
Yeah, it's a trickle down.
Gray, I have sort of a related question for you. What has happened to the Coast old money? The money that was made during the gold rush and afterwards. Where is that now? To what extent does that play a serious role in the present-day economy? And then secondly, what has happened to the actual families, to the individuals? Are there people, third, fourth generation, fifth generation people who might actually be on our side with that kind of background?
That's what my next book would be about, if I could just stop teaching. No, I really want to do a sequel to Imperial, which is tentatively called Fortunes, and it basically follows these families, because I want to find out what happened to it. And, I mean, it's essentially a way of following capital flows. What I tried to do with Imperial San Francisco was I wanted to illustrate some ideas, largely from Mumford, but to make it palatable and I'd say seductive, so that to introduce people who wouldn't normally read about it if it was in a normal dissertation to these things. So that's why I put in as much sex and murder and mayhem as I possibly could. I know people are suckers for that. I want them to take this to Hawaii and read it on a beach. So that's what I'm going to do with the other one, because I've always liked Henry James and Edith Wharton, and I realize these are the real stories. But I want to also see, what happened to this capital? What did they do with it? What did it do to them? And what did it do to the land? Because this stuff spreads out and becomes global. So I'm going to follow some of the families that made their money in the Comstock load back to Manhattan and then to Paris and London as they marry their daughters off into the aristocracy. And a lot of those people are still around now. But becoming old money, they don't want to be in the society hub. So the older money gets, the more anonymous it gets. And so really difficult to find that stuff out. I was very fortunate in the Sharon family, who I talk about a lot, are one of the few families that donated all their family papers, a lot of the family papers to the Bancroft Library, and they didn't bother to cull them before, which the Hearsts have. The Hearsts have enough money that they've culled their papers, so that if you don't know, you wouldn't be aware, for example, that there's nothing in those papers dealing with their resources and land in Mexico. They've taken that out. But the Sharons didn't take the stuff out, their resources and land in Mexico. They've taken that out. But the Sharons didn't take the stuff out. And so that was just like this golden key to begin to unlock how the system works. Now, I just read the Mackey family, John Mackey. I think they were, the woman who became his wife grew up, or spent her youth in Downeyville. And I think he was up here too. And then they beat it over to the Comstock Lode, and he becomes one of the Comstock Silver Kings. And she hated San Francisco. It was way too small for her when she'd made the money. So she goes back first to New York, and they snub her back there. And so then she goes to Paris, and London becomes this great international society hostess. And her daughter marries Irving Berlin. And then she writes this biography of her, no, I guess it was her granddaughter. And she writes this biography of this grande dame called Silver Plata. And I read through that, and it's really awful. It's really just horrible. But she gives you the attitudes, and one of the things that I think was most interesting, I knew that the Mackey family had donated money to the University of Nevada. The University of California is the Hearst University, and the Mackeys then adopted the University of Nevada in Reno. So you see the Mackey School of Mines and those buildings along the wall were built by the Mackeys. I said, that's kind of admirable. You know, the Stanfords give some of theirs back, and the Hearsts give some back, and the Mackeys. Well, it said in this book at the end that it was Clarence Mackey, the second generation, their son, who still felt some sense of responsibility for the state that so much of their money had come from. So he gave it back, and at the dedication of the mining building, he went back with his mother, this grande dame. She hated it. She talked about how she always hated Nevada. She couldn't wait to get out. She detested this university. Couldn't understand why they were giving something back. She could use it to be entertaining crowd heads in London or wherever. I just thought that was so indicative, of that kind of attitude. Now, some of the present generation, if they're at all aware that the money came actually from way back there, and some of them aren't. I went to one of the Sharon family reunions, and they had absolutely no idea where these, where their trust fund checks were coming from. They went back there. A friend of mine who does oral histories at the Bancroft Library, the mining oral histories, was standing in the Hearst mining building when they rededicated it, and some of the young Hearsts were there, and she overheard one of them say, "God, it's a beautiful building, but why is it named after our family? It's about mining, They thought it was all journalism. So these people get out of contact. But then a lot of them also are very much into the environmental movement. Dave Brower couldn't have staffed, his organizations without some of these heirs who may be still just drawing dividends, and in fact, and some of them feel guilt for where it came from. And so a lot of these are the people who sort of staff the environmental movement today. I just want them to talk, and give me the family papers, so I can continue to do this research.
What about Lucky Baldwin? You know his story? Because he took his money and put it into California real estate. He made his money go over.
Well, that's what they all did.
Yeah.
They all transmuted. I mean, it was just like that William Randolph Hearst letter. And I think it's very much like what's going on in Silicon Valley. If people are smart, they get it out of the market and put it into real estate because they're not making it anymore.
But then the real estate he bought was full of oil, but he didn't even know when he bought it, right? So he got lucky again.
But that's true of a lot of these people. I mean, it's like the, Kern County Land Company, they didn't know that stuff was over oil.
Yeah.
The big spies down in Southern California. There's a saying that it takes oil wells to feed cattle.
That's a Texas thing.
Is it? Yeah, okay. Well, it was true of California, too. So a lot of these families that, I'm not even going to say buy, acquire by one means or another, these huge tracts of property. They had so much of it, it was bound, some of it was bound to be overboiled, it turns out. I'll tell you one story about how the Tevises and the Haggans got the Kern County Land Company, which is about 480,000 acres just in Kern County alone. Then it's in Arizona, New Mexico, and everything else. Lloyd Tevis was president of Wells Fargo and vice president of Southern Pacific Railroad at the same time. And so what they do is they get these, not only do they get the big government land grants from the Southern Pacific, and that finds its way into their private portfolios, but also Hagen goes back to Washington, D.C. and uses money strategically to bribe the congressman to pass the Desert Lands Act, by which homesteaders could get 160 acres, promising to improve and irrigate it if they were on it. The day after that happened, the employees of Wells Fargo and Southern Pacific and the Customs House in San Francisco, which they also controlled, filed into the land office, filed for 160-acre parcels on land they'd never seen, and then handed it over to their agent as they walked out for $5 gold pieces. And that's part of the basis of the Kern County Land Company.
Something happened in Oregon and Washington with the warehouses.
Really, yeah. Yeah, they were really
Low
ingenious.
elevation timberland is one.
Uh-huh.
160.
Yeah.
Same thing happened with the Timber and Stone Act. The land was only theoretically useful for timber and stone, and there were sailors coming off the boat who would file claims, like pay them $5 or whatever.
I would say that if you do a real title search in California, you almost always come back to fraud.
Yeah. Jerry,
You know, it would be interesting, but probably not possible, to get some idea of the magnitude, actual economic magnitude of what old money was and what it finally becomes. Because when we use the term now, we talk about old money people. I mean, this is a mythological figure, and it may not really be anything powerful or important to America anymore, but it might be. And so it might be interesting just to chart the value of their wealth, you might say, over time.
Well, there are a lot of different stories, and I mean, I'm interested in all these. Some of them just drink and divorce it away. I mean, I know some of the scions of these families, and they've lost it, and others that are cagier. And it also depends on the kinds of lawyers and managers that they get. And some of them manage to just perpetuate it. It goes on. And the Bohemian Club's one place where old money comes in contact with new money and can perpetuate itself if people are smart. Because you have the inside track there. But there are some families that have lost it. But there's, like this Freckles family, what's his name? John Rosecrans, invested some of their sugar money in a toy company called Whammo, just at the time that they were coming up with the hula hoop, made a lot of money from that.
Did you run across when Zellerbach moved into timber after being in money?
I've run across the name, but I haven't really followed it.
Born up here at Morris Flat.
He was involved in mining. Yeah.
That'd be no Crown.
Right, and then they were over at on the Truckee too. At what's that town bomb on the Truckee? It starts with an F.
Floreston.
Floreston. Yeah, that was Zellerbach Fleischacker. Fleischacker was another one. They were very involved in that. And that was a really interesting law case because the people downstream, of course, were complaining about all this sawdust and oil and everything that was coming down from the mills in Floreston. And I talked a little bit about that.
Are you familiar with the Miller and Lux plant? How did that fit into the whole? Just huge land holding.
Yeah, that was another sort of epic fraud too, but it makes for colorful history, the cattle kings and everything. My friend David Igler is actually, his dissertation is about to be published on that through UC Press, and Dave's really gotten into it. I'm really looking forward to that. He found that, for example, their ranches are placed strategically so they could drive their cattle, so that every night they could stay on the thing. And basically, it's a chain of ranches from Kern County, all the way up to South San Francisco, where they have their slaughterhouses, and Gilroy and everything else. So they were able to do that. Their land the family, the descendants split, and they're the Bowleses and the Nichols who can't stand each other. There was a big family feud for years. They're both very, very wealthy, and they married into other of the old families, the McNears and various others. And so they're still around. They've got their foundations and everything. They're still quite wealthy. They're the old money. They're bohemian lovers and all. But when I was going through Ernest Lawrence's papers at the Bancroft, I found a letter from his brother John, Dr. John Lawrence, and they were very kind of Midwestern, aw shucks kind of guys. And he writes to Ernest and he says, "I've just met this great gal, and she's just terrific, and I really love her and everything, but you always advised me to marry well. What would you say?" So he took his brother's advice actually and married Amy Bowles from the Miller and Lux fortune. So the Lawrence family then married into that thing. They had big ranches out in the Central Valley.
Who's doing the book on the Miller and Lux?
UC Press is doing it. David Liebler wrote it. It was his.
Is that the one that's out already? I've seen that.
Is it?
In the book? Oh, yeah. It's been
Oh,
out for
great.
about 6 or 8 months.
Oh, wonderful.
It's out. Oh, yeah?
I just forgot about
IGLER. And so that'll be real interesting stuff.
John Lawrence was my faculty advisor.
Pardon?
He was my faculty advisor.
Was he? Oh.
Did you know he was rich?
Oh, yeah. He was
So
my
on the
patient.
local level, we have a development called Alta Sierra.
Uh-huh.
And in that, we have an Alioto Way.
Uh-huh.
And there's a rumor that the Alioto family had a great deal to do with that development. Do you know anything about that?
When you see a street name like that, you can pretty well bet.
Yeah, when I was on the general plan steering committee for the county, Pat Norman, the planner, and Sharon Bowden, who were planners during that period, said that they weren't sure if the whole Alioto fortune came from there, but they said a substantial increment to the Alioto fortune came from Southern Valley.
Really?
I don't, this is hearsay.
Yeah.
You should check it out.
Yeah.
There's another topic.
fortune there is there.
Well, I don't know either, but in any case, they said a huge amount of money was.
You know, it's a lot harder to do this kind of research now than it was at the turn of the century, which is why I concentrated on that. Because at that time, basically, you look at a property ownership map, and they basically use their own names. Now they almost always use a dummy corporation, and then those are hard to penetrate. I spent a lot of time going up to the Secretary of State's office in Sacramento, because there you can get the incorporation papers, and you can see who's sitting on the boards, and that offers a lot of clues, but it meant a lot of trips up to Sacramento, too.
Has your life been threatened?
Not yet.
Oh, you're not getting down there deep enough then.
That's right. Kind of insulted, actually. You know, when I used to work for KRON, there was a Sunday morning show called Weekend Extra, and they let me do these. I was working with Bell Davis from All Post, and they were great. They gave me a really long leash to do these reports on what was going on, and I didn't want an Aqua Plaza because I thought that was a real mafia kind of. It had the stench of mafia about it. And then I got really worried, and I shaved my beard because I thought I'd be identified. And I went to talk to the head of the PUC, who was this really great lefty guy named Dick Sklar, and he really knew the scene. And I said, "Dick, I'm really worried for my safety." And he said, "Ray, you think you're too important." I was so humble.
More important.
Yeah, tell me.
I wanted to ask Hank a question about you kind of quickly jumped in your history and
Yeah.
and so when did the hydraulic really take over? Was it the 50s in Nevada County? And also when is there, as you go through that primary literature, I assume you have, is there any sense of when salmon stopped coming up the river? Was it immediately after the gravel bars got dug out?
I would imagine the salmon were affected right away when you consider every bar on claims were very close together. And in the early days, and there would have been sedimentation.
I know we talked about getting salmon.
Well, they're a little Major Downey. They talk about in 1850 they found they were cooking a 14-pound salmon and found a lump of gold in it. Yeah, I don't know if that's a true story, but at least they're referring to salmon, and that's probably the last time. There's almost no mention of natural resources. They talk about loneliness and gold.
Yeah.
And regarding about 52, hydraulic mining takes off. It's to begin with, it's done by small companies of men. Every once in a while, at a site that's been worked out early, you'll find little scalloped kind of operations in the scarp.
Right close to the river, right? Where they can just
Well,
dump the
these
water.
would be on the benches, like say Minnesota Flat, which had very shallow gravels over near Allegheny. Point I'm making is, you see a scarp like this, scallop shaped, because you have one monitor, and this is really the arc of what he can handle. These are the smaller companies. What characteristically happened? These small companies couldn't pay their water bills. Water was very expensive, and it's true all over this ridge, where the water companies wind up owning all the small mines, and then they wipe out the individual. Then you have the big, huge scarp like you have at Malakoff. So and you had two periods of hydraulic mining. It's that the owner is present on the site, and one of the workmen.
And what?
And then
is that?
after you have surveys and land ownership and patents, then you get corporate investment, and the whole pattern has changed. The owner's
So in
not
the
here.
50s you have that private, 50s, 60s, the private.
Yeah, 50s, early 60s, yeah.
And then the 70s you have the.
Yeah, mid 60s, you're starting to get investment from all over. Actually, you have investment from London and Paris and New York all along. But they were a little edgy about not having legal ownership. And when it's made legal, then the money really pours in. And then everybody's an employee. Does that pretty much answer it?
So there's a boom of hydraulic mining after that patent thing you're talking about, in a way.
Yeah, and another thing that happened in that early period too is sometimes they reach a false bottom. They're all the time acquiring knowledge as they go. And what it'll be is a compacted layer through pressure. And they'll find that below that there's more of the tertiary channel. So, yeah, David.
Is it possible pre-hydraulic mining that there were any natural barriers to salmon? Like the waterfall is too high for them to jump up?
I suppose that's possible. I mean, areas like the Narrows.
But it since got filled in by hydraulic mining.
Yeah, that's possible. I don't, like I said, there's no mention. It's traditionally you get an expedition, Lewis and Clark, whatever. They send naturalists along to record all that kind of information. Not mining. I mean, it's flat out. We're going for the gold. Period. You do get some great diaries of people, but they're almost all about interpersonal relations.
Yeah.
And they're awestruck by the forest, but details about wildlife are completely lacking.
Yeah.
Completely lacking.
Every once in a while you get a minor voice. I mean, I was talking to George last night about Europe, who's a major minor voice. But we all know about him. But every once in a while there's one that gets through. And I think that there's always been some. I just don't think we have much of a voice. Who was the guy up on? Was it the Pitt River who was a government agent who became sympathetic to the Indians and set up that fish hatchery? Mike
Right.
Stevens or something? Oh, Stephen Powers.
Oh, yeah, Stephen Powell.
Yeah, pretty amazing guy.
He was here.
Yeah.
He did the first ethnology on the Nisi Mountain. And that's in 1870, so that's 20 years later.
Yeah.
And their lifestyle has completely changed by that time.
Well, I actually, when I started thinking about this, I mean, I started wondering what it was like for the people who had been up here, because hydraulic mining was invented so rapidly.
Yeah.
And then this shockwave suddenly hit, not just hydraulic mining, but the deforestation and the fires and everything. And so I asked Malcolm Margolis, and I said, well, what did it look to the people who were there? And he said, well, we just don't know, because they were living, and of course they didn't have the opportunity to leave their their accounts of it, and I thought, it must have looked like nuclear war to me.
Yeah. There's a great little anecdotal story of Luther Schaefer is working mining in Rough and Ready, and he has his pick. He's tearing into a bank. Right alongside of him is an Indian woman with a digging stick. She's also tearing into the bank for roots. And they have this moment when they look at each other and realize that each one is looking for something that's completely useless to the other, although not for the food. And they bust up, and he has this in his diary. It's pretty funny.
And what year was that?
This is in the 1850s. Yeah.
Both diggers.
Both diggers.
Both diggers.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's really true. Yeah. And regarding, like you're talking about minor voices, there's lots of mention. Thomas Starr King, lots of people who travel to the mines are really taken aback by the orange color of the river and the devastation. It's not, for most people, they think it's just wonderful technology, but some people see it for what it is and say, my God, we're just blasting down whole mountains and sending them into the river. So that voice is there, but they have no power.
That great Henry David Thoreau quote, even though he never came here, but he really got it. The one where he says, why go to California? It's only 1,000 miles closer to hell or something.
Well, for one thing, with hydraulic mining, there are 400 million cubic yards of debris washed down into the watershed.
I thought it was over 600.
600?
600.
I think there's, but it was the most hydraulic.
Yeah, it's more than the combined totals of the feather and the American and the bear all went down.
But to get accounts of what it might have been like earlier, there's the Sierra Ecosystem Study, which studies the river to see how salmon may have migrated up various channels and what populations were. Thinking back to salmon migrations, the account of when Colgate Power Plant, the head dam for Colgate was constructed in 1899, accounts that salmon, met the dam, and there's a large quantity of salmon. This is at the middle mouth of the North Fork.
That's just below Bullards?
The old Bullards.
Yeah, well, it's under Bullard's Bar right now. The old head dam for Colgate, and that there are large quantities of salmon at that dam. In fact, they're so bad they burned their corpses and things like that. It was pretty awful. But, I mean, there's a county, a powerhouse where salmon were taken down.
Yeah, I think salmon kept making a comeback. I mean, but dams put an end to that for sure.
Yeah.
Now, after 1884, the Sawyer decision, it doesn't specifically outlaw hydraulic mining, it outlaws the dumping of debris into the streams. So there were some attempts at making debris dams, 1892, the Cameron Act. And we have lots of them around here. There's one over on Willow Creek, Scotchman's Dam.
And Englebright.
And Englebright.
And
But Englebright's a bogus debris dam.
And then there's the old Bullard's Bar Dam, which was also,
Yeah.
like Englebright, was also a debris dam.
So those debris dams, if you look at if you look at the River Canyon as a resource conveyance, if I'm going to look at it, or you can look at it as a sluice itself, because it is a sluice, and the dams actually function like ripples, and so they fill up just like ripples do. Say the Willow Creek Dam, if you're not paying attention, you can walk right off the edge of it because the gravel's right up to the top. It's full of vegetation. So behind that ripple, just like in a sluice box, you're going to have elemental mercury and amalgam.
That's gold.
This is gold. And gold, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I often wonder, why don't we decommission them and have them pay for themselves?
Right?
I mean, it's a possibility.
What was the story on it? Right? Wasn't that actually built because they hoped to start?
Well, they called it a debris dam, but at the time, I mean, it's in the 1940s.
1941,
It
yeah.
has actually, if you look at it, it's a make work for locals dam, because there are very few the hydraulic miners are dead.
Yeah.
By and large. I mean, it's built as a debris dam, but in fact, I think it was just a local make-work project.
Because my understanding is actually that they hope to restart.
Yeah, I know that's the story.
But is there any evidence for that?
No. You read, I think there's some discussion of it in Gold versus Green. Kelly's book that pretty much lays it out like I'm talking about.
No, I do have some articles actually from that time that say, you know, I remember one estimated that there's something like $600 million left to be gotten out, just managed to figure it out how to do it. And that it would bring back those colorful days of Mark Twain and Bret Harte and everything. So
Oh my God.
there'd be this
Jimmy
revival of
Frost.
literature. You know.
Oh, yeah, right. Mining brings revival to it.
That's-
Yeah. Well,
Mines
mines are, when you read the mining journals, and they're always addressed what's left.
Uh-huh.
You know, and that we could go back. There's actually more left at North Bloomfield than they took out.
Yeah,
So it could have.
yeah.
Well, that whole hydraulic thing was still alive when we were here. I remember seeing banners around Nevada City, you know, during some kind of summer festival thing that said "Live and Let Live," which was the old hydraulic mine.
That's the old one, yeah. But you know, when I first started working for the Forest Service, I met people hydraulicing several times up around Weeds Point, Galena Hill. And I was told that hydraulic mining is done in the winter now, when the streams are muddy. I mean, people didn't stop, it's just a big operation stop.
Yeah.
I mean, people kept hydraulic.
Yeah.
There's a USGS on the ancient Yuba bill, 1967, that said that there was $1.4 billion in gold between Malakoff and Badger Hill. And that was when it was $35 an ounce. I have it, I got it at the ferry building one day, just happened to walk through it, and
Oh, I know the one you're talking
I got that report, yeah.
So does that mean you're gonna start tearing your garden up? He lives in Lake City. Yes.
Do
I'm
people,
sitting on a gold mine.
do people ever know about the movie called Gold is Where You Find It?
Oh, yeah.
Have you seen
No.
that? Oh, it's not well known. It was done in I think it was the 1930s. It's actually in color. It was produced by International Pictures, which was a first operation, and it's the fictionalized version of the Sawyer, of the events leading up to the Sawyer decision, and the ultimate triumph of agriculture and everything. It's got George. I mean, there are characters who play George Hurst and Leland Stanford and various other things in it. But the great thing about it is that it has got incredible footage of hydraulic mining in full operation. And gold is where you find it.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that was going on. There are multiple monitors going. I was wondering if that was.
I think I know where it was filmed. Last Chance over above Forest Hill, east of Forest Hill, had a viable operation with a debris dam up until I think about the 1960s. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. So I mean, the same thing stands. If you can impound your tailings, get it okay with the water people, I think you can still do it.
When were the dishes active? I mean, and the last use of all those dishes?
Well, some still are.
Well, yeah, some
South
are, but
Yuba Canal.
on any kind of large scale.
Well, after the, about every 6 miles along a ditch, you had a ditch tender. Ditch tender's cabin. And it would see to it that the water is free flowing. If you have a tree fall in the ditch and it blocks up and ice starts to build up, you know, it's going to affect the flow. So that's part of the infrastructure of an act. I guess what I'm saying is when the financing drops out of the infrastructure falls apart. And
So that would have been.
you had a huge winter, 1889-90, that wiped out lots of ditches. Lots of ditches. And there just isn't the startup money to pay. When you look at a hydraulic mine, you have to think of the whole thing. You think of the ditch that brings water to it, the reservoirs that provide hay, and the dam way upstream. So you're thinking about 60 miles upstream when you're looking at that's all part of the infrastructure for that.
And are there still privately owned ditch companies around here?
Well, Nevada and PG&E. I mean, yeah, the South Yuba Canal is very active for hydroelectricity and irrigation, but these fell into disrepair because this was not close enough to urban centers or the railroad.
You know, in a heavy winter, the North Columbia Dam fills up partly with water. It used to 30 years ago, just from the
Or the
3 or 4
reservoir.
miles of the
Right.
Milton Ditch that's around this area. It
Mhm.
would get partially full. It'd be 6 feet water.
But now, there's so much logging up above.
It's all been built.
It's, right now you have to, in the guidelines, you have to cross the ditch perpendicular, so you only make this one bridge. But in earlier logging, they would find the engineering is so sophisticated in these ditches. It's approximately 16-foot drop to a mile. That post-World War II logging, they would often just take one of those ditches and flatten out the berm and make it a hollow.
The Coffin water system follows the ditch for
Yeah. So putting it together now would be an awful lot of work, but we did miss it, didn't we? I mean, Pelton Wheel, hydroelectricity all began around here. And we didn't somehow keep control of that. And what are we doing now that's going on that well, maybe we are a little more aware this time around, like the river, for instance.
Yeah.
But there's got to be something that's slipping away from us right now in the same vein, like that was. Because all the appropriate technology is just right here. And there are people who have small Pelton, well, like Lester Pelton. I've actually seen that Pelton wheel, the original one. It's real small and it's encased, and the original one helped run his landlady's sewing machine. But there was even one that was used, it was used for all sorts of things, including, I don't know if this is true, dentist drill. Can you see? Now, when are you going to pay me? And he just anchor over the water.
Can you verify the story that Lester Pelton developed the Pelton wheel was inspired by his seeing, now I'm not going to draw this down to some awful low level, but his seeing the impression of a woman's buttocks in the sand with double moving.
We're sure this isn't a dream.
Consider the source.
Judge, I read that story too.
You're saying he knew his landlady better than we ever.
I've heard cows nose.
Cows know?
Yeah, that's a good
Oh, yeah,
idea.
that's one of the stories.
A more realistic explanation is there's a single bucket and it got a little off kilter and the water hit it at an angle, so the water hits it and flies out, not back at the water coming in.
I prefer this other version.
And the speed of the bucket went faster, so the idea is to have a double bucket so the water would go in and go out.
Oh, yeah, it's a huge advance in technology because you don't get the splashback on the next coming bucket. And the amazing thing, I think it's really fascinating in Nevada County in this general area, is those kinds of inventions. Like hydraulicking is basically just, there's fire hoses and fire departments in existence at that time. It's just the imagination to turn it to another use. Pelton wheel is just that little dividing cup. Hydraulic mining, Chabot's going ground sluicing with a hose. Madison puts a nozzle on it. It changes everything. I mean, they're like insight inventions, and it's really characteristic. I mean, there's a huge list of little improvements in nozzles and hydraulic lifts. I mean, the list goes on and on. Really, Nevada County was the Silicon Valley of its day. Really a hotbed of innovation.
Yeah.
That same direction, I'd like to ask Gray to say a little more about that fascinating metaphor, and it's in your book to some degree, you didn't say much about it last night, of skyscrapers as inverted minds, both technologically and metaphorically.
I still haven't found the smoking gun on that, there may not be one, but I mean, I was thinking about it because the D-Designer Square set that was used in the Comstock load, because I looked at that and I thought, this really looks like a skyscraper. And in fact, then found that there were people at the time, James Bill and various others, who likened them to gigantic buildings underground, you know. And then I realized high-speed elevators, telephones, electric lights, air conditioning. I'm going, wow, you know, I mean, this is in the 1870s. And then Daniel Burnham, one of the inventors of the skyscraper from Chicago, was out in Nevada in the 1860s working in the mines, you know. And so And that also this capital, particularly Derek Zockman Mills, takes his money back to New York and then builds this early skyscraper in 1882 directly across the street from the New York Stock Exchange. And it's one of those very early skyscrapers. And he would have been very familiar with that mining technology from Nevada. So I haven't found this out. There was, south of Market, there was one of the inventors down there he was an Irishman named Moore. And in his memoirs that Bancroft did in the Bancroft Library, he claims to be the inventor of the hydraulic lift elevator. And he says that, in fact, this will increase the value of urban real estate by being able to build up. And then he says that he took this idea, presented it as a paper in Glasgow and in New York, but he couldn't get investors involved in it, and so he didn't get the credit. So that's as close as I've ever come. But I think that there may be something in there.
Do you know what we're talking about? Does everybody follow that? What Square said?
Did the elevator come out in mind stuff? I mean, to pursue that further.
It depends on what kind of elevator you're talking about. I know the historian for the Otis Elevator Company, and essentially Otis was coming up with the idea of the safety elevator in New York in the 1850s. And I don't understand elevator technology enough, but this guy said, the hydraulic elevator was his invention, and would have come then out of this kind of technology here, using hydraulics for that.
Madison, the guy who, one of the, there were claims, various claims for where hydraulic mining was invented, and one of the criticisms of Madison was that he was too simple, he could not have invented this. But later on, he also invented an alpha diggings, a hydraulic elevator, so he's got a regular pattern invented. Which again goes back to the basic mining kind of personalities, it's inventiveness and creativity.
I think there really is a link between Nevada County and Silicon Valley. And we have a graduate student, Tim Sturgeon, who was working in Silicon Valley and who was working on his dissertation on that. And you trace it back, you find that it goes way back before Fred Terman and Stanford and everything. It's heavily linked in with military and federal investments and wireless broadcasting out in the Pacific, but particularly to the tradition of venture capital here. And this is a sort of unbroken tradition that goes back. So, and then having the Bay Area have this surplus of cheap hydroelectric energy that comes in 1901. So Dan's worked on that too. He didn't get that commemoration down in Oakland, but once you explain Square Set
Square set timbering is like a Lego concept, and it's modules and it's blocks set together. You can see a beautiful model of this at the North Star Museum in Grass Valley. And they're sort of added on to, they're blocked out, heavy timber, notched together, squares that are added onto in whatever direction you're taking your search for ore. So, and I think it is a great metaphor, the skyscrapers on the top, because they do it, except for the angling following your ore body. But,
I think we should maybe take a break now.
Okay. All right. One more thing about Deidensheimer, the guy who invented this, he originally was from Downingville.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
Yeah.
And like so many of them, he didn't profit from it.
That's the Square set timbering he invented?
Yeah.
And his name was?
Deidensheimer, is that it?
I call it Deidensheimer. I don't know. I didn't know him, so.
Yeah, I don't know either. All right, take a break. Let's take a break. Yeah. It's available for $5 most places.
Where can you buy it? Do you know exactly?
Do I know exactly?
Where could I buy it?
You can get it in the bookstore in town. You may be able to get it at Imperial San Juan, probably. I'm sure you can get it in San Juan, yeah. And over here, I have a site map of a small site, a small one over here on the South Yuba. And my point here is, in addition to these corporate mines, there are all these little operations that are further compromising the quality of water, the shape of the stream, the biota, etc. And this technology, a lot of it's done by groups of 10 or 12 people, a lot of them Chinese. They take this technology and go to Montana, Utah, Nevada, Southern Oregon, and spread that all around. So we had that diaspora too. But there you get a pretty good idea. That's about 10 acres or so. And that's the kind of site where you go by, when you're walking the South Yuba Trail, you just see mountains and mountains of tailings. Because the land has been totally stripped, and that's the waste product that won't go downstream with the current. And over here we have two maps that were put out specifically to get investors hooked. The one on the left is done about 1854, and it's done in a very hasty manner, sort of a Chamber of Commerce style manner, that was to court investors into the South Yuba Canal system, but it has some of the San Juan Ridge on it. And the one on the right was done about 1870, Eureka Lake Company. They were just about to, it's sort of a stockholders report and a pitch for more money, about 1870. The next panel over there, that's a GLO plat, when I took it from the 1870s when the area was first surveyed, and the one right of that is the tracing over it that's more clear about the current road systems and town sites today. So take a look at it if you want. Does anybody have any more questions?
Last night, where you showed a slide of Carlton Rock's photograph of the English Dam. And that is such an impressive structure. Do you know the history of that dam?
I know it was originally built and linked to the Truckee Ditch, which took it to some mines over near Allen, Minnesota Flat, and there's another small one right there, I can't think of it. Minnesota Flat is one of those places that was a very shallow gravel deposit. It was one of the early mines I was talking about. As soon as that was mined out, that was it. And it was part of a deal, I believe, when North Bloomfield Mining and Gravel Company started up in 1870, they were given that. The part of the deal was to be given that particular reservoir.
And what do you know the name of the reservoir up there now today?
Well, it's Jackson Meadows today. That was the original dam was a Rudyard or Dam Reservoir. You know, of course, what happened there. Yeah, it blew up. I believe it was right after an inspection. And it was while testimony was being put together for the Sawyer decision. So that wiped out a huge number of small claims on the Middle Yuba. I think a few Chinese died in that. There were a lot of claims on the Middle Yuba, and a lot of Chinese came to Cherokee and North San Juan who had claims there. There was a Chinatown in North San Juan. And I want to say this one thing about San Juan. We're doing a little bit of research on the Chinatown there. And Dr. Hall Mao, apparently, he was sent to the Chinese miners. There were lots of them on the Middle Yuba and South Yuba. We're distrustful of Western medicine and sent to China for a doctor. And it was Hall Mao. And Hall Mao came over about the early 1870s, and now we're finding, we found 2 hospitals in North San Juan for Chinese patients. I mean, it's amazing. This is all unfolding, but I haven't read about this anywhere. It's not the popular history.
Where were the hospitals?
Well, you know, the Catholic Church was one of the main stores. One's across the street, one's next door. Yeah, and I think when you say hospital, don't take it all away. They're basically like recovery rooms and, I guess, recuperation areas. But I forget where I was going with that, but...
what do you know about China Dam? Between...
Oh, I know what you're saying. The head of the Independence ditch.
Yeah, between...
Well, there's this bad tendency, this stereotyping tendency to call anything with a rock wall Chinese. It's not necessarily true.
That's what I was asking.
Yeah, I don't know that there was a China ditch, but it's way down near Smartsville. And that probably did use... When you think of the labor force, at certain periods, after the completion of the railroad in 1869, you've got all those people who worked on the railroad looking for jobs. So you have a real cheap labor force. And after that period, a lot of those people would have been Chinese. But you look at an area like Donnyville, which has a lot of Italians there from northern Italy, who had a lot of skills in terms of terracing already. So you just can't make that assumption. Great Wall of China, Chinese, you know, I mean, there's a whole lot of that China Wall stuff.
Yeah.
And I always, I'm mistrustful of it until I know better.
Yeah.
In the case of the China Dam,
You don't know, because that's.
although that's a relatively late ditch, it's about 1870, right?
Something like that.
Yeah, so it could very well have been mostly Chinese labor. Because
There's also supposed to be a connection with PG&E there, that was actually a functioning, the earliest hydro operation.
It's pretty close to the Rome powerhouse,
Yeah.
which may be a little upstream.
Yeah.
Ray, I wondered if in your, looking at these conglomerations of power and wealth and imperial organizations, businesses and whatnot, if you study the kind of underlying invention and kind of proliferation of the corporate structure itself, and how, you know, we've now got these corporations that claim First Amendment rights for, you know, free speech. We're inundated with the, you know, operating our political system, owning it. I mean, have you looked into that at all? I mean, it seems like it started to gain a lot of momentum after the Civil War.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It started with the railroads, actually. I mean, there's a lot of American history corporations. The railroads were quick.
Well, there's a dissertation that was done in Santa Barbara on the Comstock mines, and she feels that, in fact, it really goes to the Comstock mine even before the railroads.
Yeah.
Some of the most heavily capitalized corporations in the country were the Comstock mines in the 1860s, and were being traded on the market and everything, and that this had a great impact on the development of the stock market, and then also the corruption of the government, because the 1872 Mining Act was really the product of William Stewart. I think it had been over here, wasn't Stewart over here before he then goes over? Yeah, then he goes over to Comstock, and then I think he still has the record of one of the longest running congressmen. He had tremendous seniority. He was there for something like 50 years or so, and a fabulous corrupter. He basically he was working for Ralston and all these guys in Washington, and they got this Mining Act done in 72 that we're still laboring under today. And he had done the previous mining acts too. He really was the guy who carried the water for these companies in Washington, D.C. Now, he also was the law partner of William Sharon, Ralston's partner, who then comes into Ralston's properties, and they buy up the farms around a place in Washington called DuPont Circle, and that was known as the Nevada Syndicate. And then Sharon's son-in-law, Francis Griffith Newlands, creates Chevy Chase and Connecticut Avenue to link them up, and gets the feds to put the Rock Creek Park and the National Zoo out there to enhance the value of it, and bribes President Cleveland to be involved in the whole thing, and then passes the Reclamation Act in 1902, which gives us the Bureau of Reclamation. So all these things are tied together, and this huge wad of capital that moves back east we're still living with the consequences of this thing. But particularly that Mining Act, which obviously they're going to be in no rush to reform now.
I can't tell you how many times when I worked for the Forest Service, they'd say, well, I'm operating under the 1872 mining law. Forest Service didn't come around until 1906.
Rick, can you trace directly the wealth that came out of mining to become the wealth that goes into Silicon Valley as venture capital?
No, I can't do that. If I had more time, I'd love to do it. It's going to be really difficult, but that's the kind of research I like doing. But I'm sure that there's some there. Well, I can give you one example. Will Hearst Jr., that is William Randolph Hearst III, who was one of the few Hearsts in the family who's still got brains. He was running the Examiner in guess, late 70s and 80s, and actually did a pretty good job with it. He was sort of like Otis Chandler, and he actually brought the Examiner up and made it a pretty decent paper. But he could see that, print media is doomed in comparison with this other stuff. And so he eventually bailed out, I think in the early 90s or so, and went down and joined Kleiner Perkins Caulfield, the big venture capital firm. So they now have Hearst money involved in that too. So that's essentially one of the old Comstock fortunes now involved in Silicon Valley capital. And I suspect that there's other stuff too, as well. But, those people aren't generally going to talk about. Well, no, I know some Sharons. And one of the guys is into investment, managing capital. And of course, they're very interested in what's going on in Silicon Valley. And being members of the Bohemian Club and the Pacific Union, they have the inside track. So, but that's going to be real hard research to do.
Has anyone ever got a real good history of PG&E?
There's a very good one, sort of official history by Coleman, story of PG&E. Was that, I guess it was sort of at the centenary of what, something?
1957.
I think it was, well, it was centenary of one of the, I think the earliest company that actually was.
Rock Creek
Yeah.
Irrigation Company. So about 1954 he wrote it.
That's a really valuable history. It has a tremendous amount of information in it, but it is official, and so it doesn't have the dirt in it. The PG&E was very specific, that there would be none of that stuff. I did know somebody who was working on the building after the Loma Prieta earthquake, and he said he came up, he found a filing cabinet that was filled with stuff that he said, "You'd love, Ray." But that vanished, it's gone.
Also, Southern California Medicine Company. Well, companies, as far as I'm concerned, ripped off the people of California. And the rivers that they own.
In some ways, these energy companies were in the 20th century what Southern Pacific had been in the 19th century. I mean, they were the great corruptors because they were so well tied in and had so much capital. And there's a book called Confessions of the Power Trust, which is about the battle for public power. And it talks about there were actually 3 statewide initiatives to get public power in California in the 1920s. And it tells the story of that and essentially about their very sophisticated public relations and corruption campaign to make sure that that wouldn't happen, including, essentially putting the kibosh on professors at the University of California to speak in favor of public power. They were told that it would be worth their jobs if they did that, in fact.
So relevant. So relevant for today.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I have a question here. Stephen J. Field, appointed by Abraham Lincoln as Supreme Court Justice, one of the longest Supreme Court Justices, got his start in the gold rush.
Mm-hmm.
He was the alcalde of Marysville in
Mm-hmm. I didn't know that.
1850, before California was a state, actually. And I understand he was very instrumental in approving a Supreme Court decision that would give rights of corporations as individuals,
Mm-hmm.
citing the 14th Amendment.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any insights on that and how that decision of a gold rush, California gold rush individual, as a decision how it implies for what goes on today?
Well, I'm not going to go there. I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me from what I know about Field, and I think there is a good biography of Field, and that'd be interesting to go into. That wouldn't surprise me at all.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think East Coast historians begin to realize the importance, for national law and technology of what went on here. I mean, I know technological historians on the East Coast, and they have no idea the importance of what was going on in Northern California. They're only starting to sort of wake up to it at this point. But, earliest uses of electric lights and long-distance telephones and all of that stuff. So I think that they've got a lot to learn. I was pretty irritated that Imperial San Francisco wasn't reviewed by any of the East Coast press.
Yeah, well, we always review the books about New York, don't
Yes. We know what's important. And somebody said, well, you should write about Imperial Brooklyn, you know, then they realized this had international significance. But apparently it's part of this idea that, you know, San Francisco is just a regional city, you know, and they just don't get it.
Well, that touches on something I want to ask you about. I have an impression that is bolstered by having read New York Review of Books off and on for the last 15 years, that in an earlier time, the West, maybe back in the 20s, 30s even, San Francisco and the West Coast was perceived as a center of wealth and power and interesting history. And to a certain degree, so is Chicago, a very important center. And that the gravity had shifted out to the Midwest and the West at one point in American history. And then sometime, like around World War II maybe, it drastically shifted back to the East Coast. And the West Coast began to be seen as regional rather than international again. Does that fit any pattern that you can see?
No, I don't know. I think New York has always considered the rest of the country to be, you know, the colonies. Except for Los Angeles. I mean, New York takes Los Angeles seriously as another truly imperial city. And I think the reason for that is the importance of the entertainment industry, you know, and media, mass media. So they are linked by an umbilicus because of that mind control. But you know, they don't see San Francisco as in fact greater San Francisco, the Bay Area, and the importance of Silicon Valley for maintaining global control at this point. And if they did, then they understand that. But I guess in the 50s was they weren't taking San Francisco seriously in the Renaissance.
Only in the literary
Uh-huh.
and sort of the subcultural element.
I think they take the Bay Area seriously now because of Silicon Valley. I mean, that is the one thing you read New Yorker, New York Times, and they do have a lot of stories about that. And there are even East Coast journalists doing books like Michael Lewis doing
that's right.
new thing, you know, where they're discovering, you know, Silicon Valley and all the money that's there. So I think there is that.
Well, Tom Wolfe came out to this foreign country to get his literary start by, you know, making all these comments and explanations for people in real America of what was happening in this strange foreign country.
I think one thing too is that because San Francisco is seen as a beautiful city, it's traditionally been seen as sort of quaint and small and hence feminine. You know, people think of San Francisco as a city that feminizes it, you know. I was able to give Jan Morris a copy of Imperial San Francisco, which she took back to Wales with her, and read it on the plane. And she had formerly seen San Francisco in the same way. And she, the London Independent, asked her a whole bunch of people what they thought were the best books that they had read in the last year. And she mentioned the book, and she said, "You'll never look at San Francisco the same way as the gentlest of American cities." She talked about, she said, you know, its brutality is now revealed. Which is I think that is a real compliment because I'd forgotten that when I was in Venice, actually, I was renting an apartment where the people had a small library of books on Venice history. And there was a book there by Jan Morris, when she was James Morris, called the Venetian Empire. And it was in that I began thinking about all this because, you know, here I was wandering around Venice and thinking, God, what a beautiful, this is the most beautiful and genius city in the world. And then I read this book and I realized people in Cyprus, Crete, Istanbul hate Venice to this day for what it did to them. You know, Dalmatia, the desert coast of Dalmatia, you know, they hate it. And I thought, you know, God, that's interesting. Everybody doesn't look at Venice in the same way. And it was the same for San Francisco.
So what's ahead for San Francisco? I was there in the 60s, in this century. And,
Last section.
and it was going a different which direction, where are we going?
Ooh, boy, that's a tall order.
Yeah.
I don't know, I don't like even visiting San Francisco anymore. I mean, it's such a different place. I mean, I think it's a savage place, frankly. I think there's so much misery in that city now. I mean, such a disparity between the obscene wealth and the misery that you see on the streets that I can't stand the place anymore. You know, I go in, but I can't wait to get out of it. And it's so different. We were just talking about, you know, what it was like in the 50s, and Furman Getty just wrote a wonderful essay on how different it is now than what it was at that time.
Where can we find that essay?
It was in the it was his column in the book review section in the Chronicle. I think he's expanded on it actually. Do you know, Gary?
I haven't seen it.
Well, he talks about what it was like for a sort of young creative guy to come to the city in the 50s, and then what it would be like for the same kind of person to come there today. And it's taken on this really hard quality, and more so. And Rebecca Solman in Hollow City talks about that in a recent book, about the cultural change that's happening.
Why? Why?
Because the people who are coming there with all this money now, I mean, and bidding up everything, I mean, they have a completely different view of what the city is for.
Well, you can't just live there. You have to have a tremendous amount of money or work very, very hard to live there. I mean, rents are.
Well, I mean, I think the really creative people, most of them have been driven out because of that rise in the cost of living there. I mean, most of my friends have fled San Francisco. It's terrible. I'm still hanging on there, but it's sad to watch that community disappear. You sort of like living here and watching all the interesting people falling away.
Yeah. One last thing. On the other hand, though, I mean, some right out of left field came this recent election, which essentially, I mean, part of my dislike of San Francisco was its willing submission to Willie Brown's corruption of it. And then this election came on, and essentially it was this total repudiation of Willie Brown. And these people are doing some real interesting stuff now.
The Board of Supervisors.
The Board of Supervisors, it's a new game in San Francisco. And so it's difficult to say where it's going to go. That's why I really can't say.
And the .com economy's kind of sunk
Tanked.
In some ways. So that those two things have changed, I think, with the direction of the city, just recently.
I could give you.
And then my book came out.
I wanted to give an example of how things have changed. I was talking about a minute ago. Okay. In 1951, 52, when City Lights moved to its present location, we got that building for $60 a month. Because we had to get cheaper rent because we couldn't afford the $75 a month we were paying down the streets. So I can imagine what that building's worth now or what location's worth now.
Does Lawrence own that building?
Did he? No, I don't think so.
I think Lawrence owns it now.
You know, me own it now.
It's been landmark.
I know because last time I was there, he was doing some major renovation and repair on it himself.
All right.
Uh-huh. No, and unfortunately, it's on bedrock.
Speaking of buildings, one person that you just mentioned last night, and I was thinking when we were talking about the square sets and everything, is Andrew Halliday and that first glass curtain skyscraper our building that he built. Now, is there any relation between that and his interest in modern technology?
Well, I think he built his first wire suspension bridge on the Middle Fork of the American in 62.
Yeah, so.
There wouldn't be a connection because he was dead by that time. So,
Oh, they just named that for him?
yeah, that was built by the UC Regents, and they named it after Halliday, who had been a regent because he was president of the Mechanics Institute. So it's named in his honor. And that's why it's painted blue and gold.
Oh, no.
I always thought something.
No, that was Willis Polk who designed it, but really Polk couldn't designed that, it's too ingenious.
Oh,
It was designed by somebody in his office, actually, because Polk wasn't designing anything else like that.
yeah,
That building's really
yeah, it's a very unusual building.
That's a beautiful building. When I was going to architecture school in the '60s, of course, we'd look at that, and we were supposed to really admire it for its modernist aesthetic, but the professors would say it's really too bad they put all that ornamentation on it. If it had just been a sort of modernist building without all that gingerbread, well, fortunately, we're at a point where we can realize, that's what really makes it so wonderful.
Yeah,
It's a combination of those two things. I did want to ask you, with these Spring Valley mines down here in Smartsville, I was just sort of supposing yesterday, do you know whether there was a time at the Spring Valley Water Company in San Francisco where Schussler?
I don't know, there are a couple places named Spring Valley, there's one on the North Fork of the American too. Do you know, Dan?
Yeah, the Spring Valley is at Table Mountain at Cherokee. The Cherokee up by Highway 70 north of Portland. And that was owned by Spring Valley. And Schussler, there was a ditch system that came, I think, from Butte Creek over the west branch of the Feather River down a cyclone into Cherokee. When you go up Highway 70, you can see the eroded hill where
Yeah, that inverted siphon you were talking about is the other Cherokee.
the other Cherokee.
Oh, I see, okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's confusing.
Ever run across the name Charles Webb Howard as an investor up here?
I'll look it up.
Yeah.
That sounds, yeah.
He was the president of the Spring Valley Water Company in San Francisco, but he also owned Point Reyes.
Right.
Nice piece of property. I'm trying to get a tiny sliver of
Old families, old money again. Who was that person you mentioned last night who's now got in touch with you after the book was published and is now in Yountville?
Yeah, Gardner Mead. You
Yeah.
see his name in the society columns. He's an interesting guy, actually. He founded the Navajo Gazette.
Oh.
But he called me up because he was a little miffed because I said, I quoted the what's it called, the motto of the Navajo Gazette, which is, if you don't know it, it's this, it's known as the Snobbhill Gazette.
Yeah.
And basically it's this monthly that comes out that society loves to read because they love to see their names and the photographs of themselves holding Chardonnay. Pebble Beach and all the places where the beautiful people go. And the motto of it is not just an address, but an attitude. And Gardner established that, but it was in fact a woman named Lois Lerman who took it over and turned it into what it is today. And she came up with that motto and said he always hated that motto. He sounds like kind of a real down-home kind of guy, actually. But he also was really kind of thrilled that it was, that I mentioned his family in it. As I said, one great-grandfather was manager of De Beers and the other one of Robinson, and I think they both were here, weren't they? I think they may have worked with Smith in North Woodfield Mine.
Yeah.
So these guys, they're just scattering out, and it seems that they were being channeled by Smith through London. And there's some connection with the Rothschilds. Smith brought Edmund de Rothschild out to look at the North Woodfield Mine. So I was looking at Neil Ferguson's book on the Rothschild family, and there's almost no mention of their involvement with mining, international mining. And I think that, that's just something that he wasn't really that aware of, but I suspect it was probably through Pioche and Robinson in San Francisco that they were channeling Rothschild money up here to develop the mines up here, I suspect, and I haven't been involved in that. Pioche is a big name all over the West.
Actually, one more for you. How did the Cornish come in here? How did that, what was the connection?
Well, they're associated with hard rock mining in the first, when they discovered gold in a lode circumstance in Grass Valley. I think the first Cornish were mining at the Mariposa mine, down in Mariposa, below Sonora. And that company owned a mine, that was 1852. That company also owned a mine in Grass Valley. And so there were Cornishmen working on that. So those are the first ones I know about.
And how
So
did-
they were here with the first quartz boom, which the first quartz boom was described as in the 1850s, sort of amateurs operating untested equipment. And everybody who invested in it pretty much first time around.
Yeah.
But they were here, part of the British Empire. The largest minority, European group were from the British Empire.
Of course, the Cornish had been mining for more than
Well, they were
2,000
mining,
years.
and they were nearby. They were mining in Michigan, tin mines, etc. I love this one little quote. Some advice that they're endless tales, little quips, Cornish humor. But I read this where a woman advised her son, avoid America, go straight to Grass Valley.
There was a push for the Cornish though, because it was right at that time that their mines started playing out. The copper and the tin mines in Cornwall were starting to play out. Cornwall was falling into a depression, and then all of a sudden this opportunity opens up. So you find the Cornish in all the mining regions, in fact, and traditionally the two most desirable group to have managing their mines were the Saxons, because of their long history, and the Cornish. And so they come here. I get a lot of my information from a guy who comes from one of these mining dynasties, the Ricards, and their Cornish family. And he was the one who owned and managed the mining and scientific press. And he was I probably wouldn't have gotten along with him politically, but he was a real great mining scholar. Did a lot of stuff. And I was going to say that, one of the things that he said along the way was that what was peculiar about American mining was that the tradition of gutting the mine was do it as fast as possible, get it out, and reinvest it in other stuff. And he said that this, in Europe, they tended to husband the resource so that the town would go on. And so a few years ago I went to visit Goslar, which was one of the first big silver strikes in Europe, in the Harz Mountains. That was discovered in 962 and was still in operation 1,000 years later on. It's a UN international historic site. I think longest continuously operating mine in the world. And apparently, although it was a very wealthy kind of mine, they made sure that it produced as long as possible. So Goslar is this beautiful medieval town preserved. Nothing like what we have at all. Now that may just be because by the 19th century, capital and flows of capital were speeding up so much that it only made sense to gut the mine and invest it in something else. But I always wondered whether that was a peculiarly American thing to do. He says it was.
It's interesting, the Brazilian mining towns from the great gold boom of the 18th century, like Brechin, which is also a UNESCO historical world historical site, are really beautiful too, and have a lot of the wealth was lavished on the town right there.
Yep.
Churches and public buildings and the mansions, and it's
Same
really
with Bolivia.
substantial. And I did in Mexico too, a couple of big silver mining houses like that. So maybe, I was formulating, before you said that, and I thought of that, I was formulating this question: was there any backflow the other way from Spanish America to California in terms of, I know the early technology of placer mining and stuff, but of actual mining engineers, or had that been too far in the past to have any expertise in terms of, directors and people coming up from down there rather than it coming from here down, going the other way?
No, it seems to be one direction. They're going down there, and well, actually, just before the conquest, in fact, a lot of these old families, they have their roots generally in the South, and they had gone to Latin America to make some capital, and then they get inside information the U.S. is about to acquire California, and if they were smart, they beat it up to San Francisco and started buying land as fast as possible. And so there is that. So they bring Latin American capital up here, but then later on they're going to start investing it in mines back down there because they were familiar with the money.
But you never see the names of people from Spanish America showing up here.
No.
That's
But in those very earliest years, they were the only ones who knew anything about mining.
Yeah.
Because of mines in Sonora,
Yeah, no, I understand that part, but later on, it's not, the flow of this expert technique stuff is all.
Well, folks, I promised you that we could, that we'd be done by noon. It is about noon now. So maybe one more question for Hank or for Gray, and we'll wind it down.
Play that. Totally extractive.
Thank you.